The night Dante Vescari walked into the Ashcroft estate, Lyra was standing near the back of the room with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, watching her sister accept congratulations from people who couldn't remember her name 3 months ago. The engagement party had been Serena's idea, naturally. Everything good and loud and expensive was always Serena's idea. Lyra had worn a blue dress she'd owned for 4 years and spent most of the evening near the catering table, half listening to a conversation about real estate she had no stake in. Then the front doors came off their hinges. Not metaphorically. The actual doors, hand-carved mahogany, her father's pride, exploded inward as 6 men in black moved through the opening like water through a crack. Crystal shattered somewhere to her left. A woman screamed. The champagne flute slipped from Lyra's hand and hit the marble floor without breaking, which struck her as oddly funny for exactly 1 second before a man stepped through the wreckage and the room went completely silent. Dante Vescari was not what she expected a crime lord to look like. He was lean rather than massive, dressed in charcoal gray, and he moved through the panicking crowd the way a man moves through empty space, without adjusting, without acknowledging that anything in his path had any right to be there. His eyes swept the room once. He stopped walking. Everyone else had stopped breathing. He looked at Serena first. Of course he did. Everyone always looked at Serena first. She was standing near the fireplace in a white gown that cost more than Lyra's monthly salary, one hand pressed to her mouth, her fiancé already backing away from her with his hands raised. Dante studied her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and looked directly at Lyra. "Not her," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that scared her most. How quiet it was, like a man stating something that had already been decided a long time ago. "You're coming with me." If you've ever felt completely invisible your entire life and then had the most dangerous man in the room suddenly tell you that you were the only person he came for, you understand why Lyra Ashcroft's first instinct wasn't to run. It was to ask why. She didn't get the chance. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button before this story takes its next turn, and drop your city or country in the comments right now, because I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. What comes next changes everything. So, Lyra Ashcroft had spent 31 years being the sister people forgot to introduce. At family dinners, their aunt would say Serena's name first, and then pause slightly before saying Lyra's, the way you pause before a word you're not certain you're pronouncing correctly. At their father's funeral 3 years ago, the eulogist had described his surviving daughters as Serena, the light of his life, and her younger sister. No name, just a relational coordinate, a shadow attached to a brighter object. She had long since stopped being bitter about it. Bitterness required energy she preferred to spend on work. She was good at work. Genuinely, rigorously good. The kind of good that didn't announce itself. She designed buildings. Not the flashy kind with curved glass facades that ended up in architecture magazines. She designed structures meant to last, hospitals in flood zones, schools built on unstable ground, community centers and neighborhoods that had been told for 2 decades that something was coming. She was the person developers called when a project was failing and the person they didn't invite to the press event afterward. That was fine. She had her apartment, her drafting table, her coffee at the same time every morning, and a cat named Brutus who had the emotional range of a brick but was consistent, which she valued more than warmth. She had no reason to be at the party. She'd told Serena that directly. "You have to come," Serena had said on the phone, her voice carrying that particular mixture of expectation and mild injury she had perfected over decades. "He's going to propose at the party, and I need family there. You're my family, Lyra. You're all I have." Lyra had almost said, "You have a mother who relocated to Scottsdale and still sends you birthday money. You have 3 women from your college sorority who treat you like a cult leader. And you have Marcus, who has apparently decided to propose despite knowing you for 8 months. But she'd said she would come because Serena was her sister and their father was dead, and some things you just do." She'd arrived 30 minutes early to help set up. She'd moved furniture, approved the catering layout, fixed a power strip that kept cutting out the ambient lighting. Serena had arrived 40 minutes after the first guest, kissed Lyra on the cheek and said, "You look fine," in the tone of someone who means it as a relief rather than a compliment. The party had been in full swing for an hour when Dante Vescari came through the doors. In the immediate aftermath, the screaming, the bodyguards shoving guests aside, The sound of Marcus Hale hitting the floor hard after he'd made the extremely poor decision of stepping toward the intruders. Lyra had done something that surprised her. She'd stood still. Not frozen. Still. There's a difference. Frozen is your body refusing to process information. Still is your mind processing too much of it too fast to generate a motor response. She was cataloging, 6 men visible, 2 more at the side entrance she could see through the hallway mirror, armed but not drawing, which meant they weren't here to shoot anyone unless someone made them. Dante had not reached for anything. He was standing in the middle of her father's ruined foyer, looking at Serena with the detached interest of a man reviewing a document that turned out to be the wrong file. Then he looked at Lyra, and she understood, in a way she couldn't have articulated, that she was not an afterthought, that whatever had brought him here, she had been a specific destination all along. The look on his face wasn't hungry or cruel. It was something worse. It was recognition. "Not her," he said. "You're coming with me." One of his men had her arm before she'd processed the sentence. Not rough, firm, directional, like being redirected rather than grabbed. Serena had screamed her name in a pitch Lyra had never heard from her before, and she'd turned back once to see her sister's face. Not frightened for herself, she'd noticed, but frightened in a different way. Complicated. Like someone watching a plan develop a problem. She didn't have time to examine that. They put her in the back of a black SUV and the city moved past the tinted windows in blurred orange, and she had exactly 23 minutes to sit with her hands in her lap and decide whether to be terrified. She decided to pay attention instead. The mountain estate was 3 hours from Manhattan, which told her they'd crossed at least one state line. The road had turned to gravel 40 minutes before they arrived, and the gravel had become unmarked private road, and the private road had ended at a gate that opened without anyone speaking into an intercom, which meant they were expected, which meant this had been planned to a degree that made spontaneous resistance extremely unproductive. The house was, and this surprised her enough that it briefly interrupted her cataloging, beautiful. Not ostentatious, not the kind of display wealth usually builds for itself. It was a mid-century structure that had been expanded carefully, each addition matching the material logic of what came before. Stone and timber. She recognized the style of the original construction. Someone in the 1960s had hired an architect who understood proportion. The additions had been done by someone who'd actually studied that original work before touching it. She hated that she noticed. She noticed anyway. Dante got out of the lead vehicle. He had not spoken to her during the drive. He spoke to 2 of his men in quiet Italian she caught fragments of, accounts, access, timeline, and then he turned to her as she was helped out of the SUV and said, "You're not a prisoner." "I didn't choose to be here," she said. "No," he agreed. "Neither did I, technically." She studied his face. He was perhaps 38, she guessed, though the eyes were older than that, the kind of old that comes from a specific category of experience rather than the passage of time. There was a scar along his jaw that someone had tried to minimize with careful suturing and mostly succeeded. He looked like a man who had made a very large number of decisions and lived with the results of all of them. "Are you going to tell me why I'm here?" she asked. "Inside," he said, "after you've eaten." "I'm not hungry." "You will be," he said, and walked toward the house. She followed because the alternative was standing in the dark on a gravel driveway in the mountains, and she was, despite everything, deeply practical. She was given a room on the 2nd floor that had a lock on the inside. She tested it. It worked. That was either a genuine gesture of good faith or the specific kind of intelligence that anticipated her testing it and wanted her to feel falsely secure, and she spent about 90 seconds weighing both options before deciding that either way, she needed to sleep. She didn't sleep. She lay on a bed with good sheets. She noted the thread count involuntarily, another habit she couldn't turn off, and listened to the house settle around her and tried to construct what she knew into something that made sense. Dante Viscari. She knew the name the way educated people in certain circles knew names like his, abstractly, through news stories that mentioned him at the periphery of investigations without ever landing a direct charge. The Vescari syndicate controlled financial movement through 3 states, allegedly. Allegedly was doing a lot of work in most of those sentences. Her father had spoken of men like Dante once, at dinner, when she was maybe 22. Not in fear, she remembered now. In the careful tone of someone describing weather patterns. Something you accounted for. Something you didn't walk into unprepared. Her father. She turned that thought over. He had died 3 years ago in what the coroner ruled a cardiac event, alone in his study at 2 in the morning. Lyra had been the one who found him. She had been the one who called the ambulance, who called Serena, who sat on the kitchen floor of the family home and stared at a tile she'd stared at since childhood and understood for the first time what it meant when something permanent happened. What did he have to do with this? She didn't know, but something in Dante's voice when he'd said her name, not asked for her, not described her, just said not her as if the word her was unnecessary, told her that whoever had given him her name had given it to him as a specific thing. Not Serena's sister, not the other one. Her. That had never happened before. She fell asleep somewhere around 4 in the morning with that thought lodged in her chest like a splinter. Breakfast was served in a room off the kitchen, not the formal dining room. That detail mattered, she decided. It suggested either a deliberate attempt to seem informal or that Dante genuinely didn't use ceremony for its own sake. He was already at the table when she came down, working through what looked like a continental spread with the focused efficiency of a man who ate to function and not for pleasure. He looked up when she entered. He did not stand, which she found she didn't mind. She'd always found that particular gesture more about the man performing it than about the woman being honored. "You slept," he said. Eventually. She sat across from him and poured coffee because the pot was there and she needed it. "Are you going to explain this now or after another meal?" "Now," he said. He put down his fork. That small motion, the deliberateness of it, the way it signaled that the next thing he said had been measured, made her go quiet. He said, "Your father's name was Gerald Ashcroft." "I know my father's name." He was also known, in certain circles, as the architect of something called the Meridian Framework. She had never heard that phrase. She said so. Dante nodded like that was expected. "He wouldn't have told you. He spent a great deal of effort keeping you and your sister separate from what he built." He paused. "The Meridian Framework is an encrypted financial network, not a bank, not a transfer service. Something older and more sophisticated. A system for moving capital across syndicate lines without governmental detection. He designed it in the early 90s and spent 15 years refining it. At its peak, it handled accounts for every significant criminal operation on the East Coast and several overseas." Lyra looked at her coffee. "My father designed buildings." "Your father designed buildings as a profession," Dante said, with a patience she found unexpectedly respectful. "He was also one of the most gifted network architects of the analog-to-digital transition era. The buildings paid his visible taxes. The Meridian Framework paid everything else." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved in the tree line. A bird, probably. She followed it with her eyes because she needed somewhere to put her attention while her brain processed what her body was apparently already believing. "You're telling me my father was laundering money for organized crime," she said. "I'm telling you your father built the infrastructure that made organized crime financially survivable for 3 decades, Dante said. "That's not quite the same thing, though I understand why it feels like it is." She put her cup down. "What does that have to do with me?" He looked at her steadily. "Before he died, your father did something no one anticipated. He divided the master access to the Meridian Framework into 2 parts. Not code, not data. Something more elegant than that, and far harder to extract by force." He stopped. She waited. "He encoded it biologically," Dante said. "A cryptographic sequence written into the specific variant of a protein marker that appears in his daughter's blood. Serena carries 1/2, you carry the other. Neither key functions without the other. Neither of you can access or destroy the network alone." Lyra sat with that. Biologically encoded. Her father had. The elegance of it hit her before the horror did, which said something about her she wasn't sure she liked. It was architecturally perfect. No drive to steal, no password to torture out of someone. No single point of failure. He had turned his daughters into the lock itself. "He did this without our knowledge," she said. "Yes." "Without our consent?" "Yes." "Because he wanted to protect us, or because he wanted to protect the network?" Dante was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that he wanted both, and believed for a long time that those 2 things were the same." That landed in her chest like something heavy dropped on ice. She heard the crack of it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Before he could answer, the window behind him shattered. The shot went wide, by inches, maybe less. Dante was already moving, already had his hand around her arm and was pulling her down below the table line before she'd registered the sound as gunfire. She heard shouting in Italian from somewhere down the hall. She heard running. She pressed her back against the cabinet beneath the counter and looked at Dante, who was low beside her with his eyes on the broken window and his hand pressed flat against the floor, feeling for vibration. She realized, feeling for footsteps. "Stay below the glass," he said. She already was. "How many people know I'm here?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Fewer than this suggests." She looked at the shattered window, at the pale morning light coming through jagged edges, and understood with a cold and specific clarity that whoever had fired that shot had not been aiming at Dante Viscari. They had been aiming at her. She pressed her back harder against the cabinet and thought about her father, alone in his study at 2 a.m, and wondered for the first time whether a cardiac event was really what had killed him. They moved through the house in a crouch, Dante ahead and Lyra 2 steps behind, and she noticed that he never looked back to check if she was following. He just assumed she was smart enough to keep up, which was the first thing he'd done that she'd found genuinely respectful. The kitchen staff had vanished. The hallway was empty in the particular way that spaces go empty when people who know what gunfire means have already made decisions about where to be. One of Dante's men appeared at the far end of the corridor, heavy-set, mid-40s, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, and exchanged something with Dante in clipped Italian that she caught maybe a third of. Perimeter. 2 positions. Gone before confirmation. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means whoever fired was already leaving before the shot landed." Dante straightened up, looked at the ceiling for a moment like he was doing math. "That's not an amateur." "I didn't think it was." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, like he'd been given a data point that changed a prior estimate. "Come with me," he said. He took her to a room she hadn't seen on her way in, a study behind the main staircase, access through a door that looked like paneling until you pressed the right section of molding. She filed that away. The room was functional and dense, maps on 2 walls, a long table covered in printed documents, 3 monitors running feeds she didn't have time to parse before Dante closed the door behind them. A woman was already in the room. She was maybe 35, dark-haired, dressed with an intentionality that read less as fashion and more as armor. Everything fitted, nothing loose, a strand of pearls that looked original rather than decorative. She was standing at the table with one hand resting on a document, and she turned when they entered with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting and had chosen to weaponize the waiting. "You brought her in here," the woman said. Not a question, an indictment. "Lyra," Dante said without looking at the woman. "This is Viviana Moretti." Lyra knew the name the same way she'd known Dante's, not personally, but structurally. Viviana Moretti, who appeared in the same news periphery as Dante, but always slightly differently, always in a context that suggested her presence in his life was a given rather than a choice. His fiancée. That was the word people used, she recalled now, the way they used it about a political arrangement that had been functional for long enough that everyone had stopped asking whether it was anything else. Viviana looked at Lyra with the particular attention of a woman assessing a threat she has not yet decided how to classify. "You should have taken the sister," Viviana said. "The sister couldn't do what needs to be done," Dante said. "And this one can?" Viviana's gaze didn't move from Lyra. "She's an architect. She designs hospitals. What exactly do you think she contributes to this situation?" "More than you currently understand," Dante said, and his voice had gone to a register Lyra hadn't heard yet. Not louder, but definitively closed. End of that thread. Viviana heard it too. Her jaw tightened by maybe 2 millimeters, which Lyra suspected was as much visible reaction as she ever allowed herself. "Someone just shot at her through the breakfast window," Viviana said. "On your property, through your security perimeter." She finally looked at Dante. "You should be asking who gave us away, not playing caretaker to a woman who doesn't even know what she's carrying." The silence after that had weight. Lyra looked at Dante. "She has a point." Both of them looked at her. "About the security breach," Lyra said. "Not about me, obviously, But she's right that someone knew I was here fast enough to position a shooter before 8 in the morning. Either the security on my extraction was compromised, or someone in this house made a phone call last night. Viviana studied her for a moment, with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite its opposite. Which would you find more concerning? Lyra asked her directly. Both, Viviana said, which is why she shouldn't be in this room. She's already in it, Dante said. Viviana. That single word, just her name, just the 2 syllables, carried something between them that Lyra couldn't fully decode but recognized as old, a long argument that had been tabled many times and never resolved. Viviana turned back to the documents on the table with the controlled deliberateness of a woman deciding that a battle not fought now was a battle preserved for later. Lyra looked at the maps on the wall. They were financial maps, she realized, not geographic. The lines connecting cities weren't roads or rail lines. They were transaction corridors. She recognized the visual language because her father had drawn things like this on legal pads when she was a child, working through infrastructure problems, and she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table doing homework and absorbed the grammar of it without understanding the vocabulary. She was understanding the vocabulary now. The Meridian Framework, she said quietly. Dante looked at her sharply. She pointed at the largest node on the central map, a cluster of lines converging on a point marked only with a number. That's not a location, that's an access point, a hub. She traced one of the lines with her finger without touching the paper. And these aren't transfers, they're verification sequences. Someone is running authentication through multiple corridors simultaneously. The room was very quiet. How do you know that? Dante asked. I don't know it, she said. I'm reading it. My father drew this kind of thing while I did math homework. I've been looking at his visual language since I was 9 years old. She turned to face him. Someone is trying to access the network. Right now. Actively. Dante crossed to the table in 3 strides and pulled up something on the center monitor. Numbers scrolled. He looked at a man Lyra hadn't noticed standing in the corner. Thin, 50s, glasses, the only person in the room who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days because he genuinely hadn't. And the man said, "She's correct. Activation signals started at approximately 3:47 this morning." 3:47. She had been lying awake at 3:47, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her father. "Can you trace the origin?" Dante asked. "I've been trying," the man said. "It's routing through 17 relay points. Each one is—" He stopped, looked at Lyra, looked at Dante. "Say it," Dante said. "Each relay point corresponds to a node in the original framework design," the man said. "Whoever is running this activation sequence has the original architectural schematics, the actual source documents." Viviana turned from the table slowly. Her face had changed. The armor had shifted, not cracked, but reorganized around a new concern. "Only one copy of those schematics existed," she said. "Gerald Ashcroft kept them." "Yes," Dante said. "Gerald Ashcroft is dead." "Yes," Dante said again. "He is." The silence expanded until it filled every corner of the room, and Lyra stood in the middle of it and felt something move through her that wasn't grief and wasn't anger yet. It was the specific feeling of standing at the edge of a conclusion that you know is going to change the shape of everything before you fully landed on it. "Someone had access to his papers before he died," she said, "or immediately after." Nobody answered, which was its own kind of answer. Down. They spent the next 4 hours in that room. Lyra didn't intend to become useful. It happened incrementally. The analyst, whose name was Renner, would reach a branch point in the trace, and Lyra would look at the pattern on the screen and say something like, "That relay splits left because it's mimicking a ledger verification sequence. The original design always doubled back before confirming." And Renner would go still for a moment and then say yes, in the voice of a man who'd been pushing against a locked door and just felt it move. Dante watched this happen without commenting. He moved between the monitors and the maps and his phone, which rang 4 times in an hour with calls he took in one corner of the room, speaking in a voice too low to catch. Each time he came back, his expression was fractionally tighter. Viviana stood against the far wall for the first hour. Then she left without announcement. Then she came back. Then she left again. A woman running her own calculations about something Lyra wasn't yet privy to, and Lyra found she was more interested in that than she let show. Around noon, Renner said, I've isolated the origin corridor. It's coming from a terminal that has physical access, not remote. Someone is sitting in front of a machine that is directly connected to a primary node. Where? Dante asked. Renner looked at his screen. The node coordinates put it in Manhattan, Lower East Side. He looked up. That's one of the original installation sites. Dante's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. She caught it because she'd been watching him long enough now to know where to look. What? She asked. He put the phone in his pocket. My people at the estate confirmed something. The Ashcroft estate? Yes. He looked at her with the directness she was becoming accustomed to, which she appreciated because she'd spent a lifetime around people who looked slightly to the left of whatever they were actually telling her. Your sister left the property this morning, before 7, voluntarily, with a bag she'd apparently packed the night before. Lyra heard that. She held it. Serena packed a bag, she said. Before we arrived, Dante said. That's what my people are telling me. You're saying she knew you were coming. I'm saying she was prepared to leave before anything happened that would make leaving necessary. He paused. I don't know what that means yet. Lyra turned away from him and looked at the map on the wall. The activation signals. The relay points. The terminal running authentication sequences in the Lower East Side, which was 3 hours from the Ashcroft estate and less than an hour from where Serena had been living for the past 18 months. She was constructing something she did not want to construct. Renner, she said. When did the activation signals start? 3:47, Renner said. What time does it take to drive from upstate New York to Lower Manhattan? Renner understood the question. He looked at Dante. Dante answered it. 3 hours roughly, less at night with no traffic. So, someone who left the estate around 1 in the morning, Lyra said, would arrive in Manhattan around 4. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them has reached the same unwanted conclusion simultaneously, and nobody wants to be the first to make it real by saying it. She's your sister, Dante said, not as a defense of Serena, as an acknowledgement of what he was asking Lyra to sit with. I'm aware. Where? She said. Her voice came out leveled, which surprised her. Somewhere under it, something was moving fast, and she was choosing not to let it surface, because if she let it surface, she would not be useful, and right now being useful was the only thing keeping her from feeling the full weight of what she was beginning to understand. The argument started 40 minutes later, and it started because of Viviana. She'd come back into the room while Lyra was working through a section of the relay map with Renner, and she'd stood in the doorway long enough that Lyra clocked her without looking up, and then she'd said, Dante, we need to speak. We're in the middle of something, Dante said. Yes, Viviana said. You and her are in the middle of something. That's precisely what I need to speak to you about. Lyra kept her eyes on the screen. Dante said, Later. She's been here for 14 hours, Viviana said. She's sitting in a room with every map we have. She has access to Renner. She knows what we know about the framework. A pause, controlled and surgical. You brought in the one person every syndicate on the East Coast wants access to, and you've handed her everything. I haven't handed her anything, Dante said. She's reading things she already has the capacity to read. That's different. It's not different from where they're standing. Viviana's voice dropped half a register. Dante, think. Whoever shot at her this morning knows she's here. If they know she's here, they know what access she represents. If she cooperates with whoever comes for her next, I'm in the room, Lyra said. Both of them stopped. She turned around in her chair and looked at Viviana with the same flat steadiness she used in meetings when a client tried to talk about her to a colleague, as though she hadn't been sitting at the table for an hour. I'm in the room, I can hear you, and I'd prefer to be spoken to directly if we're going to discuss what I represent to various criminal organizations. Viviana looked at her for a long moment. Fine, she said. Directly, you are a liability. You represent access to something that multiple dangerous groups want, and the safest resolution to that problem, from a purely operational standpoint, is to ensure you're not accessible to any of them, including by your own agency. You're suggesting I should be locked up. I'm suggesting that your freedom of movement creates risk. My freedom of movement is the only thing that makes me useful to you, Lyra said. A key that's been put in a box doesn't open anything. She's right, Dante said. Viviana turned to him with something in her expression that had crossed from professional disagreement into something personal and older. "You've known her for 14 hours, she said quietly. "That's true," Dante said. "And you're making decisions based on what? She knows how to read a map. She had an interesting father." Viviana's voice stayed controlled, but her hands, Lyra noticed, had gone very still at her sides, the stillness of deliberate suppression. "You brought her here because of the framework, not for any other reason." "I brought her here to protect her," Dante said. "From whom?" "Apparently," he said, "from whoever shot through my kitchen window at 7 in the morning." "From whoever knew she was here," Viviana said, "which is a very short list." The sentence landed and sat there. Dante looked at Viviana for a moment with an expression Lyra couldn't fully read, something between an old ache and a new sharpness. "Are you telling me something?" he asked. "I'm asking you to think," Viviana said. "That's all. I'm asking you to think about who knew her location, when they knew it, and why the shot missed." She let that breathe for exactly 1 second. "Snipers at that range don't miss, Dante. Not the kind we're dealing with." The air went out of the room. Lyra felt it on her skin, the shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when a question reframes everything that came before it. She turned that over. The shot had gone through the window at an angle that suggested a position in the tree line, maybe 200 meters. That was manageable range. That was not a miss that happened because someone's hand shook. "A warning shot," she said. Viviana looked at her. "Or a message." "To whom?" Lyra asked. "To Dante," Viviana said. "To tell him they can reach you whenever they want. That cooperation would be preferable to conflict." She paused. "That's how these organizations communicate when they want negotiation rather than elimination." Lyra thought about that. "Then why shoot at me and not at him?" "Because you're the asset," Viviana said. "He's just the man currently holding you." Something about the word holding made Dante's jaw move, but he didn't respond to it. He crossed to the windows. These windows, in this room, were narrow and set high, harder to angle into, and stood with his back to both of them, looking at something or nothing. "Renner," he said, "I need the full communication log from the household network, last 48 hours. Renner did not respond immediately, which in itself was a response. "Renner," Dante said again, without turning. "I need to pull it from the secondary server," Renner said. "It'll take me 20 minutes. "Take 15, Dante said. Viviana left the room without another word. Lyra watched her go and sat with the specific feeling of a situation that had been complicated becoming geometrically more so. "Do you trust her?" Lyra asked. Dante didn't turn from the window. "Define trust. Do you believe she's not the one who made the phone call?" A pause, not a long one. "I believe she's capable of it," he said, "and I believe she'd tell me a version of the truth afterward that I'd have difficulty disproving." He finally turned. "That's not the same as knowing." "But you're with her," Lyra said. "We have an arrangement," he said. "That's different from being with someone." She didn't push that thread. It wasn't hers to pull. "Tell me about my father," she said instead. "Not the framework. Tell me about the promise. You said you made a promise to him." Dante was quiet for a moment. He moved to the table and sat across from her, which she noticed because he hadn't sat in the same room with her yet. He'd always been standing, always positioned near an exit. Sitting was a different statement. "He came to me 4 years before he died," Dante said. "Not to negotiate, not to threaten. He came to tell me that he was going to architect a shutdown sequence for the Meridian framework, a way to permanently deactivate it from the inside rather than leaving it running after his death. He wanted it gone. He was done with it." "Why come to you?" "Because he needed someone powerful enough to hold the space while he did it. The shutdown would take time, and during that window, every organization that depended on the framework would be looking for leverage. He needed someone to stand between them and his daughters while the system went dark." "And you agreed?" "I agreed," Dante said. "Because I had my own reasons for wanting the framework gone, and because he made a compelling case, and because—" He stopped. "Because?" she pressed. He looked at her directly. "Because I owed him something I couldn't repay any other way." She held that. "What did you owe him?" He didn't answer immediately. The monitors hummed. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. "He saved my brother's life," Dante said finally. 11 years ago, when my brother was in a situation that should have been unsurvivable. Your father used the framework's financial network to create a false identity, complete enough to get him out of the country before people who wanted him dead could confirm the trail. He looked at his hands. My brother has been living under that identity for 11 years. He's married. He has 2 daughters. A pause. He's a school librarian. Lyra stared at him. A school librarian? In Oregon, Dante said, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She found herself unexpectedly disarmed by that. The specificity of it. Oregon. 2 daughters. A school librarian. A real life built out of her father's machinery. He didn't tell me about any of this, she said. Not accusingly, just as a fact she was sitting with. He was protecting you, Dante said. He was making decisions for me, she said. Without my knowledge, without my consent. He turned me into a component in a system I didn't know existed. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't smooth it. I understand that he was trying to protect us, but there's a way in which making someone a key to something they've never been told about is not protection. It's just a different kind of ownership. Dante said nothing. The silence had the quality of someone genuinely listening rather than waiting for her to finish. He was a good father, she said, because she needed to say it and have it be true at the same time as everything else was also true. I was a good father, and he apparently built criminal infrastructure for 30 years and used his daughters as lock combinations and died of a cardiac event at 2 a.m. alone in his study. She stopped. Is that what happened? Did he die of a cardiac event? Dante looked at her. She knew the answer from the way he looked at her before he said anything. We don't know, he said. That's the honest answer. We don't know. She absorbed that. Something cold settled into her chest and she recognized it as not surprise, which was somehow worse than if it had been. Renner came back into the room. He was carrying a printout, which struck her as anachronistic until she understood. Printed evidence couldn't be remotely deleted. The communication log, he said. He set it on the table in front of Dante. He did not look at Lyra when he said the next part. There were 3 outbound calls from inside the estate last night, between midnight and 2 a.m., all to the same number. Dante looked at the log. His face did not change. Whose number? Lyra asked. Renner still didn't look at her. He looked at Dante. It's a routing number, Dante said, untraceable directly, but the pattern of the routing. He stopped, looked at the log again, looked up. This is the same relay structure as the activation signals on the framework. The room felt suddenly smaller. Someone in this house, Lyra said slowly, was communicating with whoever is running the activation sequence. Yes, Dante said, and doing it from midnight to 2 a.m., which means they knew you were here, Dante said, and they were coordinating the response. She thought about Viviana leaving the room, coming back, leaving again. The particular restlessness of a woman managing something on a separate track. She thought about Serena packing a bag the night before. She thought about her father dying alone in his study. And then Renner said very quietly, the calls were placed from a phone registered to the household security account. The specific device is assigned to... He stopped. He looked profoundly uncomfortable. It's assigned to your position, sir. Dante went very still. My phone, he said. Your assigned device, Renner said carefully. But the call timestamps overlap with the window when your phone was logged as inactive on the household network, meaning it was either off or shielded. The calls went through a secondary device cloned to the same account. Someone cloned my account, Dante said. Yes. And made 3 calls to a framework relay number. Yes. From inside this house. Yes. Lyra looked at Dante. His expression had gone to somewhere very focused and very cold, and she understood that what she was watching was a man who ran an organization built on the premise that his security was absolute, realizing that premise had been wrong. Viviana, she said quietly. Not as an accusation, as a coordinate. Dante stood up from the table. He crossed to the door, opened it, and said something to whoever was in the corridor. He came back 30 seconds later. Viviana left the property, he said. 11 minutes ago. Her car is gone. Lyra sat with that. 11 minutes. While they'd been looking at the log, while Renner had been pulling his printout, while Dante had been sitting at the table telling her about a school librarian in Oregon. She knew what Renner was going to find, Lyra said. Yes, Dante said, and she knew when he was going to find it. Yes, she looked at the map on the wall, the relay points, the activation signals, the node in Lower Manhattan, running authentication sequences since 3:47 in the morning. She thought about Serena with a packed bag. She thought about Viviana, moving through this house last night in the dark, making phone calls on a cloned device. She thought about the shooter in the tree line, taking aim and deliberately missing. A message. That's what Viviana had called it. She was sending herself a message, Lyra said. She staged the shot. She needed Dante to think there was an external threat, so he'd focus on the perimeter instead of the inside. Dante looked at her. She's been coordinating with Serena, Lyra said. The words felt strange in her mouth, physically strange, like something with the wrong texture. That's what this is. They're working together, your fiancé and my sister. She stopped. They're trying to access the framework, and they need both keys. She met Dante's eyes across the table. They need me, she said, and they've been 3 steps ahead of us since before you walked through my father's door. The monitoring equipment hummed. The maps held their positions on the wall. Outside, somewhere on the mountain road that led down to the highway that led back to Manhattan, a car was putting distance between itself and this room, carrying a woman who had spent the last 14 hours in the same house as them both, close enough to touch, managing a plan that had nothing to do with the one Dante had been running. Lyra looked at the door Viviana had walked out of and understood that whatever choices she'd had before this moment had just been permanently reduced. Dante made 3 calls in the first 10 minutes, and none of them went the way he wanted. The first was to his head of external security, a man named Croft, who'd been with the Viscari operation for 12 years, and who answered on the second ring with the specific alertness of someone who had been waiting for the phone to ring rather than sleeping. Dante told him Viviana's vehicle, the direction of departure, the 11-minute head start. Croft said he'd have eyes on every route within 20 minutes. Dante hung up without thanking him because that was not a dynamic that operated on gratitude. The second call was to a number Lyra didn't recognize, and the conversation lasted 40 seconds and was entirely in Italian, and when it ended, Dante put the phone face down on the table and stood with his hand pressed flat against the surface and breathed through his nose once, slowly, which was the most visible sign of strain she'd seen from him. "What?" she asked. "The terminal in Manhattan," he said. "The one running the activation sequence." He looked up. "It went dark 18 minutes ago. Someone shut it down." "Voluntarily? Or because they finished what they were doing," he said. She understood what that meant. 18 minutes ago was approximately when Viviana had been getting into her car, approximately when someone had decided the communication window was closed and the operational phase was beginning. "They completed an activation step," Lyra said. "I think so." "Which means they're moving to the next phase." "Yes." "What's the next phase?" He looked at her with that directness she'd come to read as his version of honesty. Not comfortable, not softened, just accurate. "The next phase is acquiring you," he said, "physically, willingly or otherwise." She sat with that for 3 seconds. "And the third call?" He picked up the phone again and held it without dialing. "I haven't made it yet." "Who are you calling?" "Someone who can tell me how far Serena Ashcroft has gotten and what she's carrying when she gets there." "You have someone watching my sister." "I had someone watching the estate," he said, "since before last night. Standard precaution." He looked at her. "I should have told you that." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He dialed. The call connected after 4 rings, and the voice on the other end was young and tightly controlled and reported in English this time, she noticed. For her benefit, or because this particular operative worked in English, she couldn't tell. The operative said that Serena Ashcroft had been picked up by a private car at 6:52 in the morning, a black sedan, plates registered to a holdings company out of Delaware that had dissolved 8 months prior. She had been carrying a single bag, medium-sized. She had not appeared distressed. She had not looked back at the house. She had not looked back at the house. Lyra absorbed that detail with the specific discipline of a woman who had decided not to feel things until it was operationally convenient to feel them. Dante ended the call. He looked at Lyra, and she looked back at him, and there was a moment between them that had no strategy in it, just two people sitting across from each other with the wreckage of a plan spread between them on a table. "What do you need?" he asked. She found the question unexpectedly difficult. Nobody had asked her that in a very long time without it being about a project or a deadline or a structural load calculation. "I need to understand the complete picture," she said. "Not the version you've been parceling out, everything. What the shutdown sequence actually requires, what both keys together actually unlock, and what happens to the network if someone accesses it without authorization." "If someone accesses it without proper authorization," Dante said, "the framework doesn't open. It arms." She went still. "Arms?" "Your father built a failsafe," he said. "If the keys are used coercively, if the biological markers are extracted rather than willingly activated, the network triggers a cascade protocol that doesn't erase the data. It broadcasts it. Every account, every transaction, every name, every amount, to every federal financial intelligence agency in North America, simultaneously." She stared at him. "He built a nuclear option. He called it the lighthouse function," Dante said. His logic was that the only way to make the network safe was to make accessing it forcibly more dangerous than leaving it alone. "So if Serena and Viviana try to force access, they destroy everything," Dante said, "including themselves, including every organization that ever used the framework." He paused. "Including mine." "Then they can't force it," Lyra said. "They need me cooperative." "Yes. Which means everything they've done, the coordination, the activation signals, the staged shooting, it's been about positioning, getting me in a place where cooperation feels like the only option. Or the only way to protect something you care about," Dante said. She thought about that. What did she care about that they could use? Her apartment. Brutus the cat. A drafting table with a half-finished hospital expansion in a flood zone in Louisiana. None of those were leverage. Then she thought about the school librarian in Oregon with two daughters living under a name her father had built. She looked at Dante. His face told her he'd already thought of it. "They know about your brother," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They left the estate 40 minutes later in a vehicle that was not one of the ones registered to the property. A detail that suggested Dante maintained resources his own household systems didn't fully document, which she found simultaneously reassuring and instructive. Renner came with them. Two of Dante's men rode in the front. Lyra sat in the back with Dante and a bag Renner had assembled containing printed maps, the communication log, and a laptop that operated on a closed network disconnected from anything that could be remotely accessed. The mountain road going down was slower than she expected, and she used the time to think. Her father had designed a system so dangerous that the only protection it offered was mutual assured destruction, a network that couldn't be weaponized without destroying everyone who'd ever touched it, including its architect's own daughters. He'd spent years trying to dismantle it cleanly and died before he could. He'd given the keys to people who didn't know they were carrying them and extracted a promise from a crime lord to stand between those people and a world that wanted access to something it couldn't safely have. He had been trying, she thought. In the most convoluted and paternalistic and ultimately flawed way possible, he had been trying to fix what he'd built. She found she couldn't entirely hate him for it, which made her angry in a different way, because it would have been simpler to hate him cleanly. "Tell me about the shutdown sequence," she said. "Specifically, what does it require from us?" Dante looked at the road ahead through the partition window. "The biological markers in your blood function as cryptographic keys, but they're not static, they're generative. They produce a specific sequence only when both are present simultaneously, and the activation is voluntary. Your father was a clever enough designer to include a psychological component. The sequence doesn't resolve under duress. Elevated cortisol in either subject disrupts the output." She turned that over. "He designed it so it can't be activated when either of us is afraid. Or in pain," Dante said, "or under any measurable physiological stress response. So even if they get us both in the same room," she said, "they can't use us if we're scared." "Correct. Which means they need us calm and willing." "Or," Renner said from across the seat, not looking up from the laptop, "they need to find a way to chemically suppress the stress response before activation." The car was quiet for a moment. "That's possible?" Lyra asked. "It would require specific pharmaceutical management," Renner said. "But it's achievable, if you had access to the right compounds in a controlled environment." He finally looked up. "It would look like a medical facility. It would require time and preparation. It's not something you improvise. How long would preparation take? She asked. For a controlled environment adequate to suppress both subjects' cortisol response while maintaining consciousness? Renner did the math in his head. 3 to 5 days, if they started preparing before they moved. She looked at Dante. They started this before last night, she said. Yes, he said. They've had a facility prepared. Probably. Which means they have a location already, something Viviana controlled, something Serena had access to. Dante's phone buzzed. He looked at it and his expression changed. Not dramatically, but the specific way that faces change when information arrives that confirms something you'd hoped was wrong. He showed her the screen. A location. An address in New Jersey, just across the bridge from Lower Manhattan. A medical facility registered to a pharmaceutical research company that Renner had found in 27 minutes of searching the corporate registration trails connected to Viviana Moretti's name. Registered 8 months ago. Around the same time, the Delaware Holdings company used for Serena's pickup had dissolved. Around the same time, the framework's activation signals had first shown dormant movement, according to the timestamps Renner had found in the logs. 8 months of planning. She's been doing this for 8 months, Lyra said. At least, Dante said. She looked out the window at the mountain going past. The trees were close here, dense and indifferent. She thought about Serena calling her last month about a gallery opening she didn't attend, texting her a photo of a restaurant meal, sending a birthday message that was warm and specific and referenced a private joke from their childhood about their father's terrible taste in breakfast cereal. 8 months of warmth, 8 months of specific and personal contact, making sure Lyra was reachable, locatable, emotionally connected enough to be leveraged. She had thought Serena was making an effort, trying to close the distance that had grown between them after their father died. She had thought that maybe grief had done what nothing else could and made her sister reach across the space between them. She felt the nausea of that understanding move through her body, and then she breathed through it and set it down somewhere she could pick it up later. I want to go to that facility, she said. Dante looked at her. It could be a trap. It definitely is, she said, but I want to see it. I want to understand the physical setup they've built. Because if I'm going to dismantle what they're planning, I need to know what they've actually constructed. Going near that building puts you in range of people who want to put you in a pharmaceutical suppression protocol, Dante said. I'm aware, she said. Can you get me close without getting me inside? He thought about that. Maybe, he said, with enough preparation. Then prepare, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not admiration exactly, and not concern exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Then he picked up his phone and started making arrangements. They stopped at a property in Westchester that belonged to someone in Dante's network. Not a safe house in the cliched sense, just a house whose owner was currently in another country and whose keys Dante possessed for reasons that weren't explained. It had a kitchen and working internet and a garage and no particular emotional weight. Renner sat up on the kitchen table. Lyra took the printed maps and laid them on the floor because the table wasn't big enough and worked from her knees, which was fine. She'd spent half her career on construction site floors going through blueprints in inadequate light. She found the facility's building permits in a public database using the New Jersey address. Cross-referenced the original architectural filing. The building had been a pharmaceutical storage facility in the 90s, converted to research use in 2011, then sold to the company Viviana had registered 8 months ago for a price that was below market by enough to suggest the seller had been motivated by something other than profit. She pulled the conversion blueprints, studied the HVAC layout, the electrical grid, the load-bearing specifications. Then she pulled the original floor plan and compared. They've done interior work, she said. The current registration says minor renovation, but based on the electrical upgrade they filed 6 months ago, double the original amperage draw, they've added significant medical equipment. You don't need that kind of power for minor renovation. Dante came and looked over her shoulder. He was close enough that she could hear him breathe, which she noted and set aside. What kind of equipment? He asked. Monitoring systems. Climate control precision beyond standard HVAC. Possibly imaging. She traced a corridor on the original floor plan. This interior wall is load-bearing in the original filing. If they removed it, which the amperage suggests because the new electrical run would need to go around it otherwise, they've created a single large controlled space in the center of the building. A room, Dante said. A room designed to be self-contained, she said. Temperature-controlled, electrically isolated, probably soundproofed. Big enough for multiple subjects and medical personnel. She sat back on her heels. They built exactly what Renner described. A suppression environment. The kitchen was quiet except for Renner's typing. I need the exterior approach geometry, Dante said. He was already on his phone, low and fast. She pulled the site map. Parking structure to the north, adjacent building to the east that shared a utility corridor, open lot to the south with documented camera positions from a security filing the previous owner had submitted to the municipality. She started marking angles on the map in pen. Croft called back while she was doing it. Dante took the call in the next room and she heard the cadence of it without the words. And then he came back with his face doing the thing where it went neutral specifically because he was managing what it wanted to do. What? She said. Viviana's vehicle was tracked to a private airfield in upstate New York, he said. She took a flight 40 minutes ago. To where? The flight plan filed says Montreal, he said, but the aircraft ownership traces to a shell registered in Delaware. She looked at him. The same Delaware structure as Serena's pickup. Different company name, he said. Same registered agent. She thought about that. She's not going to Montreal, she said. She filed a false flight plan. Almost certainly. Can you track the aircraft? I have someone trying, he said. She turned back to the blueprints. Her pen moved across the site map, marking the utility corridor entrance, the camera blind spots, the load-bearing geometry that told her where the interior walls of the converted space would be. Dante, Renner said from the table, and something in his voice was different enough from his previous tones that both Lyra and Dante stopped and looked at him simultaneously. Renner was staring at his screen with the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a room and found a staircase going down. What is it? Dante asked. Renner turned the laptop so they could see the screen. He had been running deep background on the corporate structure of Viviana's pharmaceutical company, tracing ownership layers, pulling subsidiary registrations, following the money through its various shells. The structure on the screen was complex, but Lyra read it the same way she read financial maps, as architecture, as a logic of connections. And there, at the base of the ownership pyramid, underneath 3 layers of holding companies and 2 foreign registrations, was a name she recognized. Not Viviana's name, not a syndicate name, not any criminal organization she'd ever heard associated with the Vescry network or anyone connected to it. The name was Harlan Foss. She knew that name. Who is that? Dante asked. He's a federal security consultant, Renner said. 30 years in public service. He advises 3 congressional oversight committees on financial intelligence and counterterrorism funding. He's testified before the Senate 7 times. Renner stopped and seemed to need to reorganize what he was about to say. He's one of the people who built the regulatory frameworks designed to detect and prosecute exactly the kind of financial network your father designed. He was looking at Lyra when he said the last part. She stared at the name on the screen. He's on the inside, she said. He's been on the inside for 30 years, Renner said. And based on what I'm looking at, he's been using that position to route criminal funds through regulatory blind spots he personally helped create. Renner scrolled down. The Meridian framework wasn't just tolerated by federal oversight. In some respects, it was protected by it. Because the man who could have exposed it was the same man profiting from its continued operation. The kitchen felt very small suddenly. My father found out, Lyra said. It wasn't a question. The logic of it was moving through her like cold water. He found out, and that's why he wanted to shut it down. Not just because he was done with it, because he'd discovered who the framework was ultimately serving. And when he decided to shut it down, Dante said slowly, Harlan Foss couldn't let that happen. A cardiac event, Lyra said, at 2 a.m, alone in his study. The room was absolutely still. She looked at the name on the screen and she felt something move through her that she had never felt before in her life. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more structural than that. It was the feeling of a foundation crack appearing in something she had stood on her entire life, and the ground that had been underneath it turning out to be something different from what she had always believed. Her father had not died of a cardiac event, He had died because he'd tried to do the right thing, and the man positioned to benefit most from stopping him had made sure he couldn't finish. She breathed through that, once, twice. Her hands were on the site map and she looked at them and they were steady, and she found that more frightening than if they'd been shaking, because it told her that something in her had already decided to be very cold about this, and that coldness had arrived before she'd consciously chosen it. "Where's Harlan Foss right now?" she asked. Renner typed. "His public schedule shows him in Washington," he said. "Committee briefing this afternoon." "Is he actually there?" Renner checked. He checked 2 more sources. He looked up. "No," he said. "He's been absent from his office since yesterday morning. His assistant logged it as a personal emergency." "The aircraft," Dante said. He was already dialing. "The aircraft Viviana took. If Foss is running the operation from the top—" The call connected and Dante's man gave him coordinates, and Dante closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "The aircraft filed for Montreal," he said. "It landed in Teterboro, New Jersey." 20 minutes from the facility on the site map spread across the kitchen floor between Lyra's knees. She looked at the map. She looked at Dante. She looked at the name on Renner's screen. "They're all there," she said. "Viviana, Serena, and Foss. They're at the facility." "We don't know that for certain," Dante said. "We know it well enough," she said. She stood up from the floor. Her knees ached from the hard tile, and she noticed that and set it aside. "And we know they're going to move fast now, because Viviana knows what we found in the communication logs. And she knows we'll trace the corporate structure eventually, and she knows that once we do, the window for what they're planning gets very small." "Which means we have hours," Dante said, "not days." "Yes." He looked at her. The kitchen light was flat and functional and not flattering to anything, and she could see exactly how tired he was. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been running an organization on controlled tension for years and has just discovered that the tension had been being managed from the outside by someone he'd never identified. "If we go to that facility," he said, "and you're right about what they've built there, we're walking into a space designed specifically to make you compliant." "I know," she said. "And Foss has 30 years of federal connections," he said. "Any conventional move we make, he has the contacts to complicate it legally before we can get traction." "I know that too," she said. "So tell me what you want to do," he said. She looked at the blueprint on the floor. The converted facility, the load-bearing walls, the utility corridor, the camera blind spots she'd marked in pen. She thought about her father at his drafting table, building the most elegant lock she'd ever heard described. She thought about him at 2 in the morning in his study, alone, the night someone decided to stop him from finishing what he'd started. She thought about Serena not looking back at the house. "I want to finish what my father started," she said, "and I want Harlan Foss to be alive and present when it happens." Dante held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to Croft's number and started explaining what they needed. They had 4 hours, maybe less. And the only way into the building Lyra had mapped was through the utility corridor. 60 meters of underground passage connecting to the adjacent structure's maintenance level, accessible from a street entrance that sat in the dead center of a camera blind spot she'd found in the security filing. She picked up her pen and began marking the approach route. Her hand was still steady, which still frightened her, and she found she no longer cared because steady was what this required and steady was what she had, and that would have to be enough. Outside, the afternoon was tipping toward evening, and in New Jersey, in a converted pharmaceutical facility with double the original electrical capacity and one large interior room where the load-bearing wall used to be, 3 people were waiting for something that her father had died trying to prevent. She was not going to let them have it. The utility corridor was exactly as narrow as the blueprint had suggested, which meant single file, which meant Dante ahead and Lyra directly behind him and 2 of his men behind her and Croft at the rear, and the smell was concrete and standing water and something chemical that she couldn't identify and didn't want to. She had changed into clothes Croft had sourced from somewhere, dark, fitted, nothing loose that could catch on infrastructure. She was wearing boots a half size too large, and she'd doubled the socks to compensate, which was the most practical decision she'd made all day, and also the most absurd thing to be thinking about 60 meters underground beneath a New Jersey street with a hand-drawn approach route in her jacket pocket and a plan that had approximately 4 variables she couldn't control. Dante moved without a flashlight. He had a small tactical light clipped to his collar, angled down, and he used it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, minimally, precisely, only when the darkness became operationally inconvenient. She followed his back and the sound of his breathing and the slight variations in the floor grade that her feet read before her eyes could. She had told him everything she'd found in the blueprints. He had listened without interrupting, which was becoming a pattern she appreciated. Then he'd made 4 calls and received 2 and assembled what he had, which was Croft and 5 men, and a timeline held together with the assumption that Viviana's people inside the facility were not expecting an approach through a maintenance corridor that didn't appear on any current documentation because it had been grandfathered in from the 1968 original construction and never updated in the digital filing system. Assumptions were load-bearing, she'd told him. Buildings fail when you assume something is solid and don't verify. He'd looked at her and said, "Tell me if anything changes." She intended to. The corridor turned left at a junction she'd marked on her sketch, and she touched Dante's shoulder once, their agreed signal for a navigation point. And he stopped, and she moved up beside him and pointed at the right-hand wall where a maintenance access panel sat at knee height. Behind that panel, according to the 1968 construction documents, was a crawl space that ran perpendicular to the main corridor and terminated beneath the utility room of the adjacent building, which shared a foundation wall with the converted pharmaceutical facility. "This is where it gets architectural," she murmured. He looked at the panel. "How long is the crawl?" 11 meters, she said. Then a vertical shaft, 4 meters, then a hatch into the utility room subfloor. He looked at her. "You've done this before?" "I've designed versions of this," she said. "Doing it is different." "It is," he agreed, and pulled the panel open. The crawl space was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which she supposed was the general principle of physical reality documentation. There was water, not deep, an inch maybe, enough to soak through the doubled socks immediately. There were pipes overhead close enough that she kept her head ducked at an angle that made her neck burn by the 3rd meter. The light from Dante's collar lamp ahead of her was intermittent, blocked by his body, and she navigated largely by touch and spatial memory. She counted her crawl strokes. 11 meters at roughly 60 centimeters per pull meant about 18 movements. She was at 14 when Dante stopped and she bumped into him. "Shaft," he said quietly. She came up beside him and looked. Vertical, as documented, maybe slightly narrower than documented. Iron rungs set into the concrete, original installation, rust visible even in the poor light but structurally. She tested the first one with her hand, pressing up and sideways, checking the anchor. Solid enough. Dante went first. She followed. Her arms shook by the second rung, not from weakness but from the specific fatigue of a body that had been running on coffee and controlled adrenaline for going on 20 hours. She breathed through it. 3rd rung. 4th. Her boot slipped slightly on the 5th, and her stomach dropped and her hands held, and she stayed on the rung and breathed. "Don't be afraid," she told her body. "We need to stay biochemically calm or none of this works." Her body found that only partially convincing. At the top, Dante had the hatch open and was already through. She came up after him into a utility room that smelled of electrical equipment and recycled air and found herself standing on a concrete floor in near darkness with functioning HVAC units along 2 walls and a single door ahead. And she put her hands on her knees for exactly 5 seconds and caught her breath and then straightened up. The 2 men came up behind her. Croft was last. They assembled in the utility room without speaking. Dante looked at her. She pointed at the door, then at the floor, then indicated left with 2 fingers. The central converted space, the room where the load-bearing wall had been removed, was on the other side of this building's east wall, accessible through a corridor that ran along the shared foundation. He nodded, checked his men. They moved. The corridor was lit with emergency lighting, yellow-tinged, and the first thing she heard when they came through the utility room door was voices. Not raised voices, working voices. The flat professional register of people managing a technical process. She heard equipment, something rhythmic and electronic. Monitoring equipment, the specific cadence of medical devices running their cycles. She heard a ventilation system working harder than standard commercial HVAC, which confirmed the climate control she'd predicted. She heard Serena. Not her words, not yet. Just the sound of her voice, recognizable even through a wall, the particular timbre of it, higher than Lyra's, carrying even in low conversation. She'd heard that voice her entire life. She'd heard it laughing and complaining and performing warmth and performing grief, and now she was hearing it through a concrete wall in a converted pharmaceutical facility in New Jersey at 9:15 in the evening, and her body did something involuntary. A full system clench, everything tightening at once, her jaw and her stomach and her hands. She breathed through it. Dante touched her arm. She looked at him. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the wall. 3 people audible. She listened. He was right. 3 distinct vocal registers, 2 female, 1 male. Viviana's lower, more controlled tone, Serena, and a man's voice she hadn't heard before, which meant either Harlan Foss or someone she hadn't accounted for. Croft positioned his 2 men at either end of the corridor. Dante and the remaining operative moved to the door at the center. A heavy fire door, code compliant, which meant it swung outward and had a standard handle rather than a push bar. Lyra looked at the door frame. The gap at the bottom showed light, bright, white, medical grade. The gap was wider on the left side than the right. It opens left, she told Dante in a breath that barely qualified as sound. He adjusted his position. She positioned herself behind him and to his right, where the door's swing wouldn't pin her. He looked at her one last time. His expression was not dramatic. It was the same focused, measured attention he'd directed at everything since she'd met him. The face of a man who had been in rooms like this before and understood that the way to survive them was not to be afraid of them, but to be precise inside them. She gave him a single nod. He opened the door. The room was exactly as she'd modeled it. Large, central, the original interior wall gone. She could see the reinforced beam that had replaced it spanning the ceiling, new steel and old concrete, competent structural work. Medical monitoring equipment along the north wall. 2 examination chairs in the center that were not standard clinical furniture. They had restraint points at the wrists and ankles, discreet, built into the armrests, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking. Climate control vents in all 4 upper corners running at a volume that told her the air composition in this room was being actively managed. 3 people turned when the door opened. Viviana, standing near the monitoring equipment, was the first to move. Not toward them, but sideways, 1 step, repositioning with the instinct of a woman who immediately calculated angles. She was dressed differently than she had been at the estate, more functional, her hair pulled back, and she had something in her right hand that she lowered toward the equipment console, and Lyra noted but couldn't identify from the distance. Serena was standing in the center of the room between the 2 examination chairs. She looked at Lyra with an expression Lyra had never seen on her sister's face before. Not guilt, not defiance. Something that was genuinely difficult to read because it contained both of those things, and also something underneath them that looked unexpectedly like relief. The third person was not Harlan Foss. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, thick-necked, dressed in the generic utility clothing of professional security, and he had a weapon out before Dante's operative could fully clear the door. The shot hit the wall 6 inches to the left of Lyra's head. She dropped. Not thought. Instinct, pure and physical, her body making the decision before her mind caught up. She was on the floor with her palms flat against the tile and her ears ringing, and she heard rather than saw the next several seconds. Impact sounds, something heavy going over, a short, sharp sound from Viviana that might have been surprise or might have been pain. When she lifted her head, Dante's operative had the shooter controlled, not down, but controlled, arms locked, against the north wall. Dante was standing in the center of the room. Croft had come through behind them and was positioned near Viviana with a professionalism that made the whole thing look, briefly and surreally, like a corporate intervention. Serena had not moved. She was still standing between the 2 chairs, and she was looking at Lyra on the floor with that expression, relief, Lyra thought again, and could not make that make sense. Lyra got up. Her hands were shaking now, which was appropriate, which was what hands did after a shot that close, and she let them shake because trying to stop it would cost energy she needed elsewhere. "Serena," she said. Her sister looked at her and said, "I wasn't going to let them hurt you." The room was quiet except for the HVAC and the monitoring equipment cycling. "Fascinating framing," Lyra said. "I mean it." "You've been coordinating this for 8 months, Lyra said. "You left the estate with a packed bag before Dante came through the door. You allied with his fiancée, and you've been running activation sequences on a network that could destroy every person whose name appears in it, including ours." She stopped. Her voice was steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for it. "And what part of that is not hurting me located?" Serena's jaw moved. "I was going to cut you in," she said. "Once it was done, once we had access, you would have had half." "Of what?" Lyra asked. "Of the money? Of the criminal empire? Of Harlan Foss's protection?" She watched her sister's face change at the name and knew she'd landed on something. "Where is he, Serena? He landed at Teterboro 2 hours ago." Serena looked at Viviana. Viviana said nothing. She was standing very still under Croft's attention with her right hand. Lyra could see it now. Empty. Whatever she'd lowered to the console, she'd left there, a phone maybe, or a control device. "Viviana," Dante said. His voice had gone to that register again, closed, deliberate. "Where's Foss?" "Not here," Viviana said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have for you," she said. She looked at him with something that wasn't defiance. It was colder than defiance. It was the look of a woman who had made her calculations and found that whatever this moment cost, she had already accounted for it. "He's managing the network remotely. He doesn't need to be present." "The terminal went dark," Dante said, 18 minutes after you left." "That terminal did," Viviana said. The room registered that. Dante looked at Renner, who had stayed in the corridor. Renner already had the laptop open, and his face said what his mouth didn't need to. "There's a secondary terminal," Lyra said. "There's always a secondary terminal," Viviana said, and something in her voice was almost tired. Not defeated. Tired. The exhaustion of someone who had been running a very long game and had reached the point where the pretense of patience was no longer useful. "Your father built redundancy into everything, Lyra. You should know that better than anyone." "The secondary terminal is running," Renner said from the doorway. His voice was careful and specific in the way that voices get when the information they're carrying is heavy. "It's not in Manhattan, it's—" He looked at the laptop. "It's running from a location in D.C. Foss, Lyra thought. Foss in Washington, running the activation from his own office or something physically close to it, somewhere that looked innocuous from the outside. 30 years of regulatory infrastructure. 30 years of access to systems designed to catch exactly what he was doing. "He can complete the activation from D.C., she said. "No," Renner said. "He can't. Not without us," Lyra said. "Without the keys," Renner said. "The biological authentication still requires both subjects present and voluntarily activated. He can run the sequence from anywhere, but the final step requires you and your sister in the same location with the same equipment." She looked at the examination chairs, the restraint points in the armrests, the climate control running managed air into a sealed space. "That's what this room is for," she said. "He built this room." "Viviana built it," Dante said, looking at his fiancée with an expression that had moved entirely past whatever personal history they shared and arrived somewhere that was purely strategic. "Under his direction." Viviana looked at him. "I built it for us," she said. "That was the original arrangement. Access to the framework, split 4 ways. You, me, Foss, and one other party who no longer needs to be named because they made different choices. Dante, you've been sitting on a declining empire for 3 years. The Viscari operation loses ground every quarter. This was the solution." "This was a trap," Dante said. "It was an opportunity," she said, "and you would have seen it that way if you hadn't—" She stopped, looked at Lyra, completed the sentence with her eyes instead of her mouth. "If he hadn't what?" Lyra asked. "If he hadn't let himself be managed by a woman who doesn't understand what she's carrying," Viviana said. "I understand exactly what I'm carrying," Lyra said. "I understand it better than you do because I understand what happens if the activation goes wrong." She looked at Viviana steadily. "If either of us is under physiological stress during the authentication sequence, the framework doesn't open. It broadcasts. Every account, every name, every transaction, to every federal financial intelligence agency simultaneously." Viviana's expression didn't change, which was, Lyra realized, the tell. "You already knew that," she said. "Yes," Viviana said, "and you built this room specifically to suppress the stress response." "Yes." "Which means Foss told you about the lighthouse function," Lyra said, "and instead of that changing your plan, you engineered around it." She looked at the equipment along the north wall. "What's in the air system, Viviana?" Silence. "What?" Lyra said, her voice going very flat. "Is in the air system." Viviana said, "Nothing yet." Yet. Lyra looked at the console where Viviana had lowered her hand. A control panel she could see now. Not a phone. A panel with a single switch, currently in the off position, connected by cable to the HVAC integration system. "If you flip that switch," Lyra said, "you introduce whatever pharmaceutical compound you've loaded into the climate system. It suppresses cortisol, makes us calm enough for the authentication to complete without triggering the lighthouse function." She paused. "But you need us in those chairs first, strapped in, so we can't leave once the air changes." Viviana looked at her with something that was almost professional respect and was also very dangerous. "You're faster than I expected," she said. "I get that a lot," Lyra said. "Usually from people who underestimated my father and are now standing in a room he designed to be impossible to win in." She was buying time. She knew it. Dante knew it. Croft was already moving slightly, repositioning, reading the room's geometry the way she read a floor plan. What she needed was for Foss to be present. Foss remotely managing the activation sequence from Washington meant the lighthouse function could be triggered without him in range of its consequences. He could broadcast the data and walk away from the blast zone. She needed him here. "Call him," she said to Viviana. "No," Viviana said. "Call him," Lyra said again. "Tell him the authentication is ready to proceed. Tell him you have both subjects and the environment is prepared." She watched Viviana's face. "You know why you need to. Because you know what I'm going to do if he stays remote." Viviana's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to activate the lighthouse function myself," Lyra said. "Voluntarily, deliberately. Without Serena, using only my half of the key, which will trigger a partial sequence that your father's failsafe interprets as coercive access. The broadcast goes out incomplete, which means it broadcasts everything except the account resolution keys, which means every name and every transaction is public, but no one can access the funds. They just get exposed." She paused. "Every syndicate, every account, every person who ever used the framework, including Harlan Foss." "You'd expose yourself," Viviana said. "My father already exposed me," Lyra said, "the day he put this in my blood." The room was absolutely still. She didn't know if she could actually do what she'd described. She didn't know if a partial voluntary activation of a single key produced the outcome she'd outlined. The specifics of her father's failsafe were architectural logic she was extrapolating from incomplete information, not verified documentation. But she had delivered it with the absolute confidence of someone describing a load-bearing calculation she'd verified 3 times. And Viviana was looking at her with the expression of a woman doing the math on whether to call the bluff. "Come on," she thought. "Think about Foss. Think about what he loses if this goes wrong without him in the room." Viviana picked up the console's secondary handset and dialed. The call connected on the second ring. A man's voice, Foss, older, the specific accent of someone who'd spent decades in institutional Washington, rounded consonants and measured rhythm. Viviana said 5 words. "The environment is ready. Come." She hung up. Lyra breathed. Dante looked at her from across the room and she looked back at him, and she could see in his face that he understood what she'd just done, and also that he understood she had just made the next 20 minutes extremely dangerous, and neither of those things needed to be said. Serena had moved during the phone call, not toward the door, not away from anyone. She had moved to the side of one of the examination chairs, and she was standing with her hand on its armrest, and she was looking at it the way people look at things they've been complicit in, and are now seeing clearly for the first time. "How long until he gets here?" Dante asked Viviana. "He was already in transit," she said. 20 minutes. Maybe less." 20 minutes. Lyra looked at the room, the north wall equipment, the control panel with its single switch, the 2 chairs, the vents in the upper corners, Croft with his hand near Viviana, Dante's operative still controlling the shooter against the wall, Renner in the doorway with his laptop tracking a secondary terminal in Washington that was still running an activation sequence. 20 minutes, and then Harlan Foss would walk through a door in New Jersey to personally oversee the authentication of a network he'd spent 3 decades protecting. And when he came through that door, every leverage point in this entire construction would be in one room. She looked at Dante. "We need to be ready," she said. For what specifically? He asked. For the moment he realizes we're here and decides the broadcast is preferable to the alternative, she said. Because a man who's been running this from the inside for 30 years has a dead man switch somewhere. Something that triggers the lighthouse function whether we cooperate or not. We just don't know where it is yet. Dante looked at Viviana. Does he have a dead man switch? Viviana looked at the floor for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Lyra watched a woman recalculate what loyalty was worth against what survival required. And then she said, the secondary terminal in DC, it's on a timer. If Foss doesn't input a reset code every 4 hours, it initiates automatic sequence. When was the last reset? Dante asked. Viviana looked at the wall clock. 2 hours and 47 minutes ago, she said. 1 hour and 13 minutes, Lyra thought. We have 1 hour and 13 minutes before a terminal in Washington automatically begins broadcasting the names and transactions of every criminal organization in North America, including everyone in this room. And Harlan Foss, the only person who knew the reset code, was 20 minutes away. She looked at Dante and he looked at her, and the calculation between them required no words at all because it was perfectly simple and perfectly terrible. They needed Foss alive, in this room, and willing to input that code in under 1 hour and 13 minutes, which meant that whatever happened when he walked through the door, the outcome had to be managed with surgical precision. And there was no room for any version of this that involved someone making an uncalculated move. The HVAC hummed its steady pharmaceutical-loaded breath. The monitoring equipment ran its cycles. Somewhere in the building, the elevator or the stairwell, she couldn't tell which, she heard the first distant sound of a door. Foss was early. Lyra straightened her spine, put her shaking hands in her pockets where no one could see them, and turned to face the door. The door opened and Harlan Foss walked in like a man arriving at a board meeting he'd called himself. That was the first thing that struck her. Not his age, which was late 60s, not his size, which was unremarkable, not his clothes, which were the careful business casual of Washington institutional life, a man who had learned to look like furniture in rooms where decisions were made. What struck her was his composure. He came through the door, took in the room, Dante, Croft, the controlled shooter against the wall, Lyra standing in the center of a space he'd paid to build, and his expression adjusted by approximately nothing. He looked at Viviana first. You didn't mention company. The situation developed, Viviana said. I see that. He looked at Lyra. He looked at her the way her father's colleagues had sometimes looked at her, with the faint surprise of men who had constructed a mental image of someone based on second-hand information and were now recalibrating against the actual person. You're faster than the timeline suggested, he said. Gerald always said you were. She felt the use of her father's name like a hand pressing on a bruise. She kept her face where it was. Harlan Foss, she said. You advised the Senate Committee on Financial Intelligence 7 times. You helped draft 3 pieces of counter-laundering legislation. I did, he said, all of which contained provisions you personally ensured would leave the Meridian framework undetectable, she said. He tilted his head slightly. That's a prosecutorial framing. I'm not a prosecutor, she said. I'm an architect. I'm looking at what you built and describing its function. Something moved in his eyes. Appreciation, she thought, which was the most unsettling possible response. Gerald said that too, he said, that you describe things by their function rather than their intent. He found it clarifying. Stop using my father's name, she said. He was my colleague for 22 years, Foss said. I used his name before it meant something painful to you. You had him killed, she said. The room was very still. Foss looked at her without flinching. Gerald made a decision to dismantle something that 30 years of interconnected organizational infrastructure depended on, he said. The consequences of that decision were not something I could prevent. You could have prevented them by not ordering them, Dante said. Foss looked at Dante with the specific patience of a man who has spent decades managing people who thought they were more dangerous than he was. Mr. Viscari, he said, your organization's financial survival for the past 11 years has depended on the framework's continued operation. You understand that, don't you? The accounts your organization holds, the transfer corridors, the verification sequences, all of it runs through infrastructure your empire requires. Gerald's shutdown would have taken you down with everything else. I knew that, Dante said. I agreed to it anyway. Foss studied him. Then you're either extraordinarily principled or extraordinarily foolish. Gerald thought it was worth it, Dante said. That was enough for me. Something crossed Foss's face. Not guilt, not regret, but a species of genuine confusion, as if the concept of taking someone else's moral assessment as sufficient grounds for action was a logical structure he genuinely couldn't parse. He trusted you with a great deal, he said. I always thought that was his most significant miscalculation. You were his miscalculation, Lyra said. He trusted you first, before Dante, before any of this. She watched Foss's face. He told you he was building the shutdown sequence. He came to you because you were his colleague, and he trusted your judgment. Foss was quiet for a moment. He came to me, he said carefully, because he wanted institutional cover for the shutdown process. He thought having federal oversight would protect him during the window. And instead you used the information to position yourself to stop him, she said. I used the information, Foss said, to ensure that a decision with consequences for hundreds of interconnected operations was not made unilaterally by one man who had developed a conscience late in life. He developed a conscience, she said. You arranged for him to never use it. Foss looked at her for a long moment and then said, What do you want, Lyra? The reset code, she said, for the terminal in D.C. He didn't react to that, which confirmed that he'd known about the timer, which meant he'd known they knew about it, which meant his arrival ahead of schedule wasn't early. It was calculated. He'd been close. He'd been waiting for Viviana's call because he'd anticipated that Lyra would maneuver Viviana into making it. She felt the ground shift under her by approximately 1 degree. You knew we were here, she said. I suspected, he said. When Viviana's call came, I was already in the building. She looked at the door he'd come through, at Croft, at Dante. He has people in the building, she said. Dante's hand moved before she finished the sentence. He said something short and sharp to Croft, who moved to the door and opened it, and looked into the corridor and then pulled back and said one word, 3. 3 people in the corridor they'd come through, between them and the utility room, between them and the crawl space and the maintenance shaft and the street. Foss clasped his hands in front of him in the gesture of a man waiting for a meeting to proceed. I want the same thing I've always wanted, he said. Clean access to the framework. Controlled activation, willing subjects, no lighthouse trigger. Everyone walks away with what they came for. He looked at Lyra, including you. I'm not your enemy. You killed my father, she said. I made a decision that resulted in your father's death, he said, with the precision of a man who had spent decades in rooms where language was the primary weapon. That's not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing, she said. Perhaps, he said, but it doesn't change what's in this room or what the next 47 minutes require. 47 minutes. He'd done the calculation already. He knew the timer window. He was telling her he knew so that she would understand that cooperation was the only path that didn't end with a broadcast that destroyed everyone. She looked at Serena. Her sister was still standing beside the examination chair. She had not moved toward Foss, had not oriented toward him the way that people orient toward the person they're allied with. She was standing with her hand on the chair's armrest, and she was looking at Lyra with that expression, the one that had confused her since they'd entered the room, the one that looked like relief. Serena, she said, tell me what you actually want. Serena's jaw moved. She looked at Foss briefly, not for permission, Lyra thought, but with the look of someone checking whether a person they've been afraid of is watching. And then she looked back. I wanted the money, Serena said. That's the honest answer. I wanted what Dad built, and then decided we weren't allowed to have. He spent our whole lives building something enormous, and then he was going to erase it and leave us with nothing, and I thought, she stopped. I thought it was ours, by right. I thought we were owed it. So you went to Viviana, Lyra said. Viviana came to me, Serena said. 8 months ago. She knew about the framework. She knew about the keys. She said there was a way to access it that was clean and safe, and nobody got hurt. And Foss? Serena looked at the floor. He came later, 2 months ago. Viviana said he was a necessary partner. I didn't know about Dad until... She stopped again. Until when? Lyra asked. Until 3 weeks ago, Serena said. When I asked Viviana directly why Dad had died before completing the shutdown, and she told me. The words came out flat and specific in the way of things that have been held still by force. I asked Foss about it. He confirmed it. He said it was necessary. And you stayed, Lyra said. Serena looked up. I didn't know how to leave, she said. I didn't know who to go to. I thought if I stayed and cooperated, I could find a way to… She stopped. Her voice had developed a fracture in it. I left the estate early because Viviana told me to, and I was scared. Not of Dante, of what happens to people who become inconvenient to Harlan Foss. The room absorbed that. Foss's expression had not changed significantly during Serena's account. He looked at her the way you look at a mild weather event, noting it, finding it unsurprising. 38 minutes, he said. Lyra looked at him. She looked at the console, the switch in the off position, the pharmaceutical compound loaded into the HVAC system, waiting for the circuit to close. She looked at Dante. He was looking at her with full attention, not telling her what to do, not running his own calculation visibly, just present and watching and waiting for whatever she decided to do next, with the complete confidence of a man who had decided to trust her judgment in a room where trusting anyone was the most dangerous possible thing. She thought about her father at his drafting table, the most elegant lock she'd ever heard described, a system so perfect it could only be defeated from the inside by someone who understood its own architecture. She walked to the console. Foss moved, fast for a man his age, faster than she'd read him. And Dante moved faster, and Croft had Foss by the arm before he'd covered 2 meters, and the room compressed into a single second of everyone calculating everyone else's position simultaneously. She reached the console. She looked at the switch. Then she looked at the HVAC panel beside it, the actual climate control unit, not the pharmaceutical integration line. She found the manual override. Her father had built redundancy into everything, Viviana had said. She was counting on it. She isolated the pharmaceutical intake valve from the HVAC flow. Manually. Using the building's own engineering, the original 1968 HVAC logic that hadn't been updated in the renovation permits because whoever designed the pharmaceutical integration had not been as thorough an architect as they'd believed. The compound stayed in its reservoir. The air in the room remained unchanged. Then she turned to the monitoring equipment and found the biometric interface, the reader designed to authenticate the cryptographic sequence from her blood. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about what voluntary meant. She thought about fear and what it cost, and whether she was afraid right now in a way that would trigger the lighthouse function. She was not calm, but she was clear, and she thought distantly that her father might have understood the difference. She pressed her palm to the reader. The equipment registered her marker. 1 key. Half a sequence. Incomplete authentication, which in the framework's logic meant coercive access had been attempted, which meant the lighthouse function would arm. Foss understood what she'd done before the equipment finished processing. That arms the broadcast, he said. His voice had lost its boardroom management register. Something underneath it had surfaced. Not panic, but the sharp, ugly sound of a man confronting a calculation that has just gone negative. You've armed it without completing the sequence. It'll trigger automatically in 31 minutes, Renner said from the doorway. He'd been timing. Of course he had. The reset code, Lyra said to Foss, stops the DC terminal, which stops the cascade, but the lighthouse function I just armed only has 1 deactivation path. She looked at him. Full voluntary authentication, both keys completed correctly. Then complete it, Foss said. I will, she said. After you give Renner the reset code for the DC terminal, after you make a recorded statement about my father's death that is specific and admissible, and after Dante's people take custody of everything in this room. She held his gaze. You get clean access to nothing. You get your name off a broadcast list and your freedom, and you spend the rest of your career hoping that's enough. Foss looked at her for a long time. The monitoring equipment cycled. The HVAC ran clean air through 4 corners of a room built to make her compliant, running clean now because she'd used the building's own bones against the plan constructed inside it. 29 minutes. Foss looked at Renner. He said a 16-character alphanumeric string from memory, without hesitation, the way men of his kind always had their exits memorized before they walked into a room. Renner's hands moved. He verified. He looked up and gave Dante a single nod. Lyra put her other hand on the biometric reader and waited for Serena. Her sister crossed the room without being asked, without hesitating, and pressed her palm beside Lyra's. The sequence completed. The framework did not open. It closed. The shutdown sequence her father had begun 3 years ago and never finished completing in the remaining logic of the system, the architectural intention of a man who had built something and then spent 20 years trying to find the right way to unmake it. The monitoring equipment ran one long tone and went silent. Lyra took her hand off the reader. Her palm left a print on the glass that faded slowly in the recycled air. 26 minutes on the clock. Renner, confirming the DC terminal, had accepted the reset and then the shutdown cascade. Croft's voice in the corridor, managing the 3 people Foss had positioned there, none of whom apparently had instructions for what to do when their principal had just handed over a code to a man with a laptop. Dante came and stood beside her. She looked at what remained of the room. The equipment, the chairs with their discrete restraint points, the switch she hadn't flipped, the pharmaceutical reservoir that had never entered the air. "It's done?" he asked. "The framework is shutting down," she said. "It'll take 6 to 8 hours to complete the cascade, but it's done." He looked at her with an expression she had no clean category for. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly. Her knees ached. Her hands had stopped shaking and started again. Somewhere in her chest, a grief she'd been holding at a controlled distance for the past 20 hours was beginning its approach, and she could feel it coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. "No," she said, "but I will be." He nodded. That was enough. The 6 hours it took the framework to complete its shutdown cascade were the longest of Lyra's life, and she spent most of them in a folding chair in the corner of a room she had helped dismantle. Croft's people secured the facility floor by floor with the systematic efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before, and had learned that the most dangerous moment in any operation was the one immediately after the apparent resolution, when everyone's attention relaxed by a fraction and the variables that hadn't been accounted for found their opening. She watched them work and cataloged the building's structural reality against the blueprints she'd memorized. A habit, involuntary, the professional mind continuing its assessment even when the professional stakes had passed. Foss had been placed in the facility's small administrative office with 2 of Dante's men outside the door, and Renner's laptop running a recording that had captured his statement in its entirety. 16 minutes of Harlan Foss speaking with the careful, measured diction of a man who had decided that the controlled demolition of his own position was preferable to the alternative, and who brought to that demolition the same institutional precision he'd brought to everything else for 30 years. He named dates. He named accounts. He named the intermediary who had handled the logistics of Gerald Ashcroft's death, not himself, never directly himself. The architecture of his culpability as layered and compartmentalized as the financial network he'd protected. Dante listened to the recording once, standing in the doorway of the administrative office with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of managing something that wanted to express itself differently. When it finished, he looked at Renner and said, "Get that to 3 separate locations, not digital, physical copies, tonight." Renner was already printing. Viviana had been separated from the room early. Croft's decision, practical and clean, removing the variable most likely to complicate the remaining dynamics. She had not resisted. She had walked out of the converted space with the posture of a woman who had made her calculation and found that its outcome, while not what she'd planned, was survivable. She'd looked back once at Dante, and whatever passed between them in that look was brief and complete, and not something Lyra tried to read because it wasn't hers to understand. The shooter Dante's operative had controlled was a contracted professional with no particular loyalty to Foss or to Viviana, a man who had been hired for a specific evening's work and had discovered partway through it that the organizational context had shifted significantly. He cooperated with everything Croft asked him, because his cooperation was the most direct path to walking out of a building in New Jersey and returning to whatever life he maintained elsewhere, and he was smart enough to recognize that. Serena sat against the north wall for the first hour without speaking to anyone. Lyra let her. She understood that what her sister was sitting with was not simple and did not have a clean resolution available to it, and that pressing on it before it had found its own shape would be the kind of thing that caused permanent damage rather than the temporary damage that healed. She had spent her career understanding load distribution, knowing which structural members could bear pressure and which ones, if you pushed them while they were already stressed, would fail in ways that couldn't be reversed. She waited. Around the second hour, Serena got up and came to the folding chair beside Lyra's and sat in it, and they were quiet together for a while in the way of people who had grown up in the same house and knew the texture of each other's silences. I told myself it wasn't my fault, Serena said finally. About Dad. I told myself I didn't know, so it wasn't on me. You didn't know, Lyra said. I knew something was wrong, Serena said. 3 weeks ago, when Viviana told me. I knew, and I stayed anyway. Her voice was even. Not performing calm, genuinely flat. The flatness of someone who has already done their crying in private and arrived at the place on the other side where the truth just sits there, dry and immovable. I told myself I was trapped, but I wasn't trapped. I was convenient. There's a difference. Lyra thought about that. Yes, she said. There is. Are you angry at me? Lyra looked at the wall across from them. The beam spanning the ceiling where the load-bearing wall had been removed. Someone had done that work competently. The right steel specification for the span, properly anchored. She found herself respecting the structural decision even in a building constructed for something she found reprehensible, which said something about professional habit that she wasn't sure how to categorize. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think I will be. I think there's going to be a version of this that I feel very differently about in 3 months when the immediate circumstances aren't sitting on top of everything else. She paused. But right now I'm mostly tired and you're my sister and Dad is dead. And I'm sitting in a building in New Jersey at midnight and I don't have the energy to be angry at you tonight. Serena looked at her. Her eyes were red at the edges, but her face was dry. That might be the kindest thing you've ever said to me. It's the most accurate thing, Lyra said. I don't have a good record of kind. Neither do I, Serena said. Obviously. They sat with that. The HVAC ran clean air through the vents. Somewhere in Washington, a terminal was completing its shutdown sequence, each node going dark in the order her father had designed, the architecture of a system dismantling itself according to the plan of the man who'd built it, finishing now what he'd been prevented from finishing in his study 3 years ago at 2 in the morning. She thought about him doing the work of this place over decades, the technical elegance of it, the sheer architectural intelligence required to build something that complex and that durable. She thought about him at his drafting table with his legal pads, working through problems in the visual language she'd absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it, and she thought about the fact that she had read his maps without being taught to read them, and wondered how much of who she was had been shaped by watching someone do work she hadn't known the purpose of. She found she didn't know how to be angry at him either. Not tonight, maybe not ever, cleanly. Maybe that was a grief she would carry the way you carry old structural damage, not visibly, but present in every calculation you made about what you could hold. Renner came to her at the 3rd hour with the laptop and a question she hadn't anticipated. The framework's cascade is running correctly, he said, sitting in a chair he'd dragged over from the equipment console. But there's a component I didn't account for. She looked at him. What component? The accounts, he said. The active accounts in the network. When the cascade completes, the network closes and the accounts become inaccessible. The funds locked in limbo, technically ownerless. No transfer possible, no withdrawal, no access by anyone. He turned the laptop toward her. The total value currently held across all active accounts is approximately $4.3 billion. She looked at the number on the screen. That becomes nothing, she said, when the network closes. Not nothing, Renner said. The value exists. The funds are real. They're just held in a structure that no longer has access architecture. They'd need a legal framework to be claimed by any surviving financial institution, and given the nature of the accounts, no legitimate institution would touch them. So they're effectively gone, she said. Yes, he said. Unless someone filed the appropriate legal instruments within the shutdown window. There's a 12-hour period after cascade completion during which a designated account holder can submit a transfer authorization to a legitimate escrow. After that, the window closes permanently. She stared at him. My father built a 12-hour redemption window. He built a lot of things, Renner said. This one I think he built for exactly this moment. She looked at the screen. $4.3 billion sitting in a closing architecture, and a 12-hour window that her father had included in a shutdown sequence he designed 3 years ago, before he died, before he could complete it himself. He had known someone would complete it for him. He had left the window open, She sat with that for a long time. What happens to money that gets transferred to a legitimate escrow from a criminal network? She asked. Legally. It depends on the escrow's mandate, Renner said carefully. If the escrow was established as a restitution fund, the assets would be distributed according to a board-appointed process: infrastructure investment, community restitution, institutional repair. He paused. There's precedent. It's complicated, but it exists. She thought about hospitals in flood zones, schools on unstable ground, community centers in neighborhoods that had been told for 2 decades that something was coming. She thought about her father's legal pads. Can you set that up? She asked. The escrow. Tonight. Within the window. Renner looked at her. I can build the structure, he said. You'd need a legitimate fiduciary institution to administer it. And you'd need the transfer authorization, which requires the network's master access. Which no longer requires biological authentication, she said, because the authentication sequence completed when Serena and I activated the shutdown. Correct, he said. The master access is open until the cascade finishes. After that, nothing. She stood up from the folding chair. How long do we have in the window? Renner checked. Cascade completes in approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, then 12 hours. Start building the structure, she said. I'll get Dante. Well, Dante listened to the full explanation without speaking, and then he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at her. You want to take $4 billion in criminal funds and redirect them into a restitution escrow, he said. Yes, she said, using a window your father built into a shutdown sequence 3 years ago. Yes. Which he apparently anticipated someone would use in approximately this manner. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. My organization's accounts are in that network, he said. I know, she said. She looked at him directly. That's part of it. He held her gaze. She watched him sit with what she was actually saying, that she was asking him to consent to the liquidation of his organization's held assets into a fund he would have no claim on and no control over. That the operational capital the Vescari Syndicate had been accumulating through the framework's protection would go into infrastructure for communities that had never heard the Vescari name except in connection with things that hurt them. My brother's identity, he said. It was built through framework accounts. I know, she said. The identity itself is real. It exists in state and federal records independent of the framework. The accounts that funded its construction are gone regardless. They close with the network whether or not we use the window. She paused. He stays who he is. His daughters are still his daughters. Dante looked at the floor. He looked up. The Vescari Syndicate loses its financial reserve, he said. The organization survives that for maybe 18 months before it starts contracting. You told me you wanted the corruption gone from the inside, she said. The people Viviana was working with, the operations that were running on betrayal rather than loyalty. She kept her voice even. Maybe contracting is what that looks like when it's honest. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might be about to tell her no, and she was preparing for that, preparing to accept it as his right. Then he said, I'll need Renner to walk me through the authorization process. She breathed. I'll send him over. The escrow took 3 hours to structure properly. Renner worked with the focus of a man who understood that what he was building would outlast everything else in this room by decades, and who brought to it a corresponding precision. He pulled in a fiduciary framework used for international restitution proceedings, legitimate, documented, with a board structure that required independent governance and public accounting. He named it in the filing documents the Ashcroft Meridian Trust, which was either the right name or too sentimental, and she couldn't tell which, and decided it didn't matter. Dante signed the transfer authorization at 4:47 in the morning. She co-signed it beside him. The cascade completed 40 minutes later, and in its final 12-hour window, $4,316 million moved from a closing criminal architecture into a structure designed to exist in daylight. She watched the transfer confirmation come through on Renner's screen and felt nothing dramatic about it. Just a kind of structural satisfaction, the feeling of a calculation that had been running for 3 years finally resolving to its correct answer. Her father's arithmetic, completing itself. She stepped outside for the first time since they'd arrived. The New Jersey air at 5 in the morning was cold and smelled of the river and diesel from a freeway somewhere behind the building, and she stood on the facility's side entrance step, and breathed it in and let her body understand that it was over in the way that bodies need to understand things, through sensation rather than language. Dante came out a few minutes later and stood beside her. He had a cup of coffee from somewhere in the building that he handed to her without comment, and she took it and held it and didn't drink it immediately, just let the warmth move into her hands. "Foss," she said, "what happens to him?" The recorded statement goes to 3 investigative journalists and 2 federal oversight bodies by morning, Dante said, independent of each other. He'll spend the next decade trying to manage what that produces. He paused. He won't serve time. Men like him rarely do. But his access is finished. His position is finished. The infrastructure he used to protect the framework is now the infrastructure documenting what he did with it. "That's not justice," she said. "No," he said. "It's the closest available thing." She looked at the sky. The darkness had shifted from black to a deep grayish blue at the horizon. Not quite dawn, but the suggestion of it. The moment before light commits. "Viviana," she said. "She had arrangements I wasn't aware of," he said. "She always did. She'll surface somewhere. Different name, probably. She's organized enough for that." He said it without bitterness and without grief, which she found more affecting than either would have been. "We were never—" He stopped. Chose his words with the care of someone who had learned that the wrong word in the wrong moment created damage that was hard to repair. The arrangement was functional for a long time. It stopped being functional when she decided that function was more valuable than— He stopped again. "Then what?" she asked. He looked at the horizon. "Then people," he said. She decided that the network and the money and the operational structure were the real things, and that people were instruments within them. That's when it stopped. He paused. "I think she always believed that. I think I chose not to examine it for a long time, because examining it meant accounting for what I'd been willing to accept." She listened to that without filling the silence after it. "I've been willing to accept a great deal," he said, "for a long time, because the alternative required changing things I'd built my entire life around." He looked at his coffee cup. "Your father looked at what he'd built and decided it needed to come down, even if it cost him everything. I watched him make that decision, and I called it principle. I didn't ask myself whether I was capable of the same thing." "Are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I signed this transfer authorization," he said. "That's one decision," she said. "One night, under extreme circumstances." "Yes," he said, "but you have to start somewhere." She looked at the horizon. The blue was deepening now at the edges, the darkness thinning. "The Vescry Syndicate," she said. "What does it look like in 18 months if it contracts honestly?" "Smaller," he said. "Much smaller. The operations that run on fear and coercion go first because those are the ones that can't sustain themselves without the financial backing the framework was providing. What's left is—" He thought about it. "Real estate, some of it. Legitimate shipping contracts. 3 restaurants that are genuinely profitable." He almost smiled. "One of them has very good pasta." "A crime lord with a restaurant," she said. "A man with a restaurant," he said. "The other thing has a shorter shelf life than I used to believe." She finally drank the coffee. It was bad. Facility coffee, old and slightly burnt, and it was exactly what she needed. Serena appeared in the doorway behind them. She had found a jacket somewhere, too large for her, and she was holding it closed at the front with both hands against the morning cold. She looked at Lyra, and then at Dante, and then at the horizon with the expression of someone seeing a sky they weren't certain they'd earned the right to see. "There are things I need to do," Serena said. "Legal things. I know that." "Yes," Lyra said. "Renner said a lawyer who specializes in voluntary disclosure." "He'll send you the contact," Lyra said. "Tonight." Serena nodded. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at Lyra with the expression that had confused Lyra in the facility, the relief. And Lyra understood it now. It was the relief of someone who had been waiting for a consequence to arrive and had lived, for 8 months, in the specific dread of its approach. The consequence was here. It was real. And it was going to be difficult. And it was not as bad as the waiting had been. That was what relief looked like when it came from an honest place. "Dad would have been—" Serena started. "Don't," Lyra said quietly. Not harshly, just with the specific weight of someone who was not ready for that sentence and knew she might never be entirely ready for it. Not yet. Serena closed her mouth. She nodded. She went back inside. Lyra turned back to the horizon. The light was coming now, genuinely coming. The first real color at the edge of the sky. Not blue anymore, but a pale and tentative gold that didn't make promises, just appeared and let itself be what it was. "There's something I haven't told you," Dante said. She looked at him. "The night I came to the estate," he said, "the engagement party. I'd been watching the situation for 3 months before that. The activation signals on the framework's dormant channels. The early movement that suggested someone was trying to position for access. I knew something was coming. I knew I needed to move before it did." He looked at the horizon. "But the reason I took you instead of Serena, it wasn't only because of the keys." She waited. "Your father wrote me a letter," he said, 14 months before he died. Handwritten, delivered through 3 intermediaries. In it, he described his daughters. He paused. He described Serena as someone who loved beautiful things and had never been asked to pay the full price for any of them. He said that wasn't her fault. It was his. He'd protected her from cost for so long that she'd lost the ability to calculate it. He stopped. "He described you differently." "How?" she asked. Dante looked at her. The pale gold at the horizon was catching now, spreading slowly upward, and in its early light she could see his face clearly for the first time since she'd met him. Not the operational face, not the face managing a room or a threat or a calculation, but the face underneath all of that, which was tired and careful, and something she didn't have a word for that was close to genuine. "He said you were the only person he knew who understood that a structure's purpose was more important than its beauty," Dante said, "and that you had never in your life built something you didn't believe should exist." He paused. He said if it ever came down to someone deciding whether the framework deserved to exist or not, you were the only person he trusted to make that call honestly. She stood with that. The gold at the horizon spread upward into the dark, and the dark thinned and retreated, and the first thin line of actual sun appeared at the edge of the New Jersey skyline, industrial and unglamorous and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the building behind her. Her father had known. He had known it might come to this, and he had trusted her with the decision, and he had died before he could tell her any of it. Died because a man with 30 years of institutional access had decided that one person's conscience was an acceptable casualty, and she had made the decision anyway, without being asked, without being told she'd been trusted with it, because it was the right structural answer, and she had always known how to read a structure. She felt the grief arrive then. Not dramatically. It came the way weather comes when you've been watching it approach for hours. Not as a surprise, not as an assault, but as the thing that was always going to arrive and was arriving now because the circumstances had finally cleared enough space for it. She didn't try to stop it. She let it be what it was. Dante stood beside her and didn't say anything and didn't move away. And she was grateful for both of those things in a way she didn't try to articulate. 3 weeks later, she went back to work. The hospital expansion in Louisiana was still waiting. The foundation specifications, the flood zone load calculations, the question of which structural members could bear what the ground in that part of the country was going to ask of them over the next 50 years. She sat at her drafting table in her apartment with Brutus occupying the corner of the table he'd claimed as non-negotiable territory, and she spread the plans out and looked at them and understood, for the first time in her career, that she was not just building something that needed to stand. She was building something that needed to stand in particular, in that specific ground, against that specific water, for those specific people who would walk through its doors in conditions that would test everything she specified. She had always known that. She knew it differently now. Renner sent her updates on the Ashcroft Meridian Trust's administrative board twice a week. The fiduciary institution had accepted the mandate and appointed independent governors. The first funding allocations were under review. Infrastructure projects in 6 states, 3 of them the kind of community investment that had been promised and deferred for decades. She read the updates and filed them and went back to her calculations. Serena called on a Tuesday evening. The call was brief and factual. Her attorney had made contact with the appropriate oversight bodies. The voluntary disclosure process had begun. The timeline was uncertain, but the path was clear. She said she was staying in the city for the duration. She said she'd been looking at her life and finding it considerably less furnished than she'd believed. She said she was thinking about going back to school. For what? Lyra asked. I don't know yet, Serena said. Something that requires me to learn something I don't already know. Lyra thought that was probably the most honest thing her sister had said to her in years. She said so. Serena was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad would have found that funny." And Lyra said, "Yes, he would have." And they stayed on the line together for another minute without filling the space, and then said goodnight in the way of people who are beginning, tentatively and without any guarantee, to learn what it means to be honest with each other. Dante came to the city on a Thursday. He didn't announce it as a visit. He sent a message that said he had business in Manhattan, and was she interested in bad pasta at a restaurant that had become unexpectedly legitimate. And she had looked at that message for approximately 10 seconds and then typed back a single word. The restaurant was on the Lower East Side. Small, genuinely old, the kind of place with water stains on the ceiling tiles that nobody had bothered to repair because the regulars didn't come for the ceiling. The pasta was not bad. The pasta was, in fact, very good, which she told him, and he looked at the table with what was probably as close to embarrassed as he got, and said, "The chef has been there for 19 years. He doesn't actually know who owns the place." "Does that bother you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "It used to seem practical," he said. "Now it seems," he paused, "like something worth changing." She looked at him across the table in the yellow light of a restaurant that had no reason to be good and was good anyway. He had the same tired eyes and the same careful manner and the scar along his jaw that someone had tried to minimize with competent suturing. He looked like a man who had made a very large number of decisions and was beginning the process of deciding differently, which was not the same as undoing anything but was its own kind of structural work. "What happens to you now?" she asked. "Honestly?" "Honestly," he said, "I spend the next 18 months reducing something I built too large and too dependent on things I shouldn't have depended on. I close the operations that can't run without coercion. I keep the ones that can stand on their own." He looked at his wine. "It will be smaller. It will be mine in a way it hasn't entirely been for a long time." "And the people in your organization who won't accept that?" she asked. "Some of them will leave," he said. "Some of them I'll have to ask to leave more directly." He looked up. "That part won't be clean." "No," she said. "It won't." "I know," he said. "I'm not pretending it will be." She believed him. That was the thing she kept returning to, across every interaction since the night in the estate kitchen when the window had shattered and he'd been beside her before she'd processed the sound. Throughout everything that had followed, she had consistently found him to be a person who told her the truth, even when the truth was not the most advantageous available statement. In her experience, that was rarer than almost any other quality and worth considerably more. "I want to build something," she said. He looked at her. "What kind of something?" "The trust has funding for infrastructure now," she said. "Real funding. And I have the specifications for 6 projects that need to be designed by someone who understands what it means to build for ground that isn't stable. I've been doing that work alone for 12 years. She looked at him steadily. "I don't need a partner. But I think the work would benefit from someone who understands what it means to operate in complicated terrain and still build something that stands." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual proposal," he said. "I'm an unusual person," she said, "in an unusual position, with access to unusual resources and a very specific skill set and no particular interest in pretending any of this has been normal." He looked at her. The restaurant moved around them. Other tables, other conversations, the particular noise of a city that had continued its own operations without reference to anything that had happened in a converted pharmaceutical facility in New Jersey. "The trust would have to vet me," he said. "The trust vets everyone," she said. "The board is independent. I don't control it." "And if they approve it," he said. "Then we build something," she said. "That's all. We see what it looks like when it's done, and we decide from there." He picked up his wine. He looked at it, then at her, with the expression she had learned was his version of arriving somewhere he hadn't planned to arrive and finding it unexpectedly correct. "All right," he said. She picked her own glass. Outside, Manhattan continued its perpetual, indifferent motion. The city her father had walked through for decades, carrying things she hadn't known he was carrying, that had been built into her blood without her knowledge, that she had used not to open something but to close it, permanently, in the way he had always intended. She thought about him at his drafting table. She thought about the legal pads and the visual language and the way he'd looked up sometimes from his work, and caught her watching and said nothing, just nodded slightly, as if her presence was something that needed no explanation and no ceremony. She thought, I finished it, Dad. It took people you trusted and people you didn't, and a building in New Jersey, and a man who kept his word to you for 11 years, but it's done. The thing you built and couldn't unmake is unmade. The window you left open, someone came through it. She didn't say any of that. She held it instead, the way you hold something that belongs only to you, in the private architecture of what you carry and don't put down. The dawn over Manhattan through the restaurant's single window was urban and gray and completely ordinary. She found it, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely sufficient.